Welcome, Bills Mafia, to the season finale of the History of Buffalo Football, Season 1, 1915. Buckle that seatbelt because the Bills bus is about to travel back in time. November 14th, 1915. The final game of the season. One final Sunday, one final challenge. The leaves had nearly disappeared. The temperatures continued to fall. And football season in Western New York was nearly at its end. But one question remains. Could anyone score on Buffalo? 6 games played, 5 wins. 1 tie, 0 points allowed. And waiting at Ryan's Park, the one team that had already survived them, the Rochester Jeffersons. Perfection meets its greatest test. 3 weeks ago, Buffalo traveled to Rochester, carrying an undefeated record and one of the most dominant defenses in Western New York. What followed was 60 minutes of football warfare. 5,000 fans watched as Buffalo and Rochester battered each other from opening kickoff to final whistle. Broken noses, broken ribs, and not a single point scored. The final score, 0-0. It was the only game all season Buffalo could not win, and the only team that walked away believing they could match them. Since that afternoon, Buffalo had returned home and outscored its next 2 opponents 84-0. But the questions from Rochester never went away. Who was truly the better team? Could Rochester finally crack Buffalo's defense? Could Buffalo finally defeat Rochester? Now, the rematch had arrived. One final game, one final opportunity, and one final chance to settle what began in Rochester. Standing across the field from Buffalo on November 14th was the one team capable of matching them punch for punch, the Rochester Jeffersons. Founded in 1898 and owned by Leo Lyons, and carrying one of the strongest football traditions in New York, their record entering the game stood at 1 win, 0 losses, and 3 ties. But the most important number wasn't in the win column, it was 0. Just like Buffalo, Rochester had not allowed a single point all season. Think about that for a minute. 2 football teams, combined record of 6 wins, 0 losses, and 4 ties, and neither defense had been scored upon. This wasn't simply a rematch. This was a collision between the 2 best defensive teams in Western New York. 3 weeks earlier, they fought to a scoreless tie in Rochester. Now, the Jeffersons arrived in Buffalo carrying the same goal as every other opponent: end the streak. But unlike every other opponent, Rochester had already proven they could stand toe-to-toe with all Buffalo. And on this cold November afternoon, the stage was set for the biggest game of the 1915 season. As the week progressed, newspapers across Buffalo and Rochester couldn't stop talking about the rematch. The headlines were simple, but they carried enormous weight. Jeffersons versus all Buffaloes. All Buffaloes to play Jeffersons. Jeffersons to play all Buffaloes Sunday. And almost every story focused on the same incredible fact. Neither team had been scored upon. The Rochester newspapers proudly reminded readers that the Jeffersons had prevented every opponent from crossing the goal line. Buffalo papers answered with the same claim. The All Buffaloes had not allowed a point all season. One article described the matchup as a meeting between the claimants of the Central New York champions and the Western New York champions. Another simply stated, no opponent has crossed either team's goal line. 3 weeks earlier, these teams had battled to a scoreless tie in Rochester. Now, the rematch would decide who could finish the season on top. The anticipation spread far beyond the players. Special train services were arranged for the fans to journey west, as well as automobile caravans. Buffalo knew this game wasn't just another Sunday afternoon, and Rochester knew it too. One newspaper called it the second and last game of this important series for the championship of New York State. The season had come down to this: 2 unbeaten defenses, 2 regional champions, 1 final game. And somewhere, someone would finally have to blink. When the dust settled at Ryan's Park, there was no debate. The headline the next morning read, "All Buffaloes win from Jeffersons." After 3 weeks of anticipation, after a scoreless tie in Rochester, Buffalo finally had its answer. The final score, 34-0. The team that nobody could score against had finally been scored upon, and scored upon often. The newspapers praised Buffalo's complete performance, the running game, the passing attack, and a defense that once again completely shut down Rochester. Jeffrey, Henneman, Dooley, Sherman, Provenza, the stars were everywhere, but perhaps the most important number wasn't 34, it was 0. For the 7th straight game, Buffalo had not allowed a single point. The perfect defense was complete. If the first headline celebrated Buffalo's victory, the second one captured just how one-sided the rematch had become. Runaway for all Buffaloes. Jefferson Football 11 of Rochester buried under big score of 34-0. 3 weeks earlier, these same teams had battled through 60 scoreless minutes. Neither side could gain an advantage. Neither side could find the end zone. This time, Buffalo left no doubt. The All Buffaloes scored in every period. 14 points in the first, 7 in the second, 7 in the third, 6 in the fourth. Rochester entered the game without allowing a single point all season, but they left Buffalo having surrendered 34. And perhaps the most telling detail came from Rochester itself. While Buffalo newspapers devoted articles and stories to the victory, the Rochester papers barely covered the game at all. One report simply listed the score, and even that they got wrong. Maybe there wasn't much left to say. The rematch had answered every question. Who was the best team in Western New York? Who owned the strongest defense? Who deserved the championship? On November 14th, 1915, the answer was Buffalo, and they proved it in overwhelming fashion. When the 1915 season finally came to an end, the numbers were almost impossible to believe. The old Buffaloes finished with a record of 6 wins, no losses, 1 tie. They were unbeaten. They were Western New York champions. And after 7 games, they had still not allowed a single point. Their season began with a 7-0 victory over the Tonawanda Frontiers. Then came a 26-0 win over the Selkirks, a 32-0 victory over Lancaster, a scoreless tie with Rochester, a 52-0 domination of the Iroquois Indians, a 32-0 win over the Oakdales, and finally, a 34-0 statement over Rochester in the rematch. Added all together, 183 scored, 0 allowed. Not 1 touchdown, not 1 field goal, not 1 point. And perhaps most remarkably, the old Buffaloes became so dominant, some rivals simply refused to play them. The challenge games stopped coming. The championship debates ended because on the field, Buffalo had already provided the answer. The 1915 All Buffaloes didn't just win games. They completed one of the most dominant seasons in early football history. 6 wins, 1 tie, 183 points scored, 0 points allowed. perfection. Looking back more than a century later, it's easy to focus on the numbers. 6 wins, 1 tie, 183 points scored, 0 points allowed. But what makes the 1915 All Buffaloes truly remarkable goes beyond the statistics. This wasn't a modern football team. There were no charter flights, no $1 million training facilities, no 60-man rosters. In fact, as the season came to a close, Buffalo was so confident in its talent that part of the organization was playing football somewhere else. While the All Buffaloes were completing their perfect season in Buffalo, the All Buffalo reserves were in Detroit taking on the Heralds. Now, the Heralds won that game, but they weren't facing the team that had dominated Western New York. They were facing Buffalo's reserves, the junior varsity version of the All Buffaloes. Think about that for a moment. The best players remained in Buffalo. The championship team remained in Buffalo. And even while part of the organization was hundreds of miles away, the All Buffalo still completed one of the greatest seasons of the era. That's how deep and how respected this football organization had become. Not just a team, an organization. And perhaps the biggest lesson from 1915, the foundation of Buffalo professional football, wasn't built on one star player or one great afternoon. It was built on depth, preparation, discipline, and a belief that whoever took the field wearing Buffalo's colors were expected to win. A century later, that still sounds a lot like Buffalo football. The victory over Rochester was supposed to be the final chapter for the 1915 season. But technically, one more game remained on the schedule. On November 21st, the All Buffaloes were scheduled to take on the Lancaster Malleables. Now, the game never happened. Lancaster canceled. Now, we don't know exactly why. The newspapers never gave a clear explanation. But it's hard not to look at the timing. Buffalo had just completed an unbeaten season. They had outscored opponents 183-0. They had shut out Rochester twice. And they had already defeated Lancaster, a different squad, but a Lancaster squad, earlier in the season by a score of 32-0. Maybe there were scheduling problems, maybe there were financial concerns, or maybe nobody was excited about volunteering to be the next shutout victim. Whatever the reason, the cancellation effectively closed the book on the 1915 season. And what a season it had been. A brand new Buffalo football organization, an unbeaten record, a perfect defense, and the foundation of a franchise that would eventually become one of professional football's most important teams. More than a century later, Bills fans still celebrate toughness, defense, resilience, and pride in representing Buffalo. Those traditions didn't begin with the AFL, they didn't begin with the NFL, and they didn't begin with the Buffalo Bills. They began right here with the All Buffaloes of 1915. Ooh, yeah. You know something, Bills Mafia? The Madness has talked a lot all season about shutouts, about perfection, yeah, and dropping elbows all over Western New York. And the All Buffaloes backed it up every single time. But tonight, the Madness isn't thinking about touchdowns, no. Or championships, or even perfect defense, yeah. Tonight, I'm thinking about those men, the players who pulled on those black and orange uniforms in 1915, yeah. The men who played this game for the love of football, yeah. Played through injuries and built something bigger than they could ever imagine, yeah. Because more than 100 years later, we're still talking about them, yeah. 6 wins, 1 tie, 183 points scored, yeah. 0 points allowed, yeah. Yeah, that's not just a great season, no. That's forever, yeah. You know, in wrestling they say champions come and go. Somebody comes along and takes your place. But once in a while, A team does something so special that nobody ever forgets it. Yeah, the 1915 All Buffaloes were one of those teams. Yeah. So tonight, raise that imaginary toast or football. The madness salutes Gene Dooley, Douglas Jeffrey, Sherman, Henneman, Proventia, yeah, and every man who helped build Buffalo football. You finished the job. You completed perfection. Ooh, yeah, the cream of the crop rose to the top. I'll see you next season. Dig it? Yeah!
The Bills have scored. It is bedlam. It is pandemonium. It is fandemonium. It is fantastic.